He came home 3 hours early carrying a diamond necklace for the woman he thought had sacrificed everything to raise him. 30 seconds later, he was standing outside his bedroom door, listening to that same woman tell his wife something that shattered 35 years of his life. "He isn't even my real son." Ethan Blackwood stopped breathing, but that wasn't the part that destroyed him. His mother continued, coldly, "I only kept him because his father left everything to him." The billionaire CEO felt the hallway tilt beneath him. The woman he'd spent his entire life calling Mom had just admitted that his entire childhood might have been built on a lie. Then he heard his wife's voice. Quiet, almost pleading. "Please, don't tell him." Ethan's heart broke for a completely different reason. Why would the wife he had spent 2 years defending his mother against protect the woman who had humiliated her? What had Amara discovered? How long had she known? And what could possibly be so terrible that she was willing to let her own husband misunderstand her, hate her, and believe she was the problem? Ethan slowly reached for the bedroom door. He had no idea that opening it would destroy the family he thought he knew, or that the woman inside was about to become the only person who could save him from the truth. Because Amara hadn't been hiding the truth to protect his mother. She had been hiding it to protect him. Welcome back to Mr. James' Family Return. Here, every story is about love, betrayal, family, and second chances. If you believe people deserve a chance to make things right, subscribe and stay with us until the end, because sometimes the person who stays silent is the one carrying the deepest truth. Now let's begin. The woman he never defended, the velvet box sat in Ethan Blackwood's coat pocket like a small, expensive heartbeat. He'd left the office 3 hours early, something he hadn't done in over a year, because tonight felt different. Tonight he was going to fix something. His mother's birthday was in 2 days, and the necklace inside that box, platinum chain, a single flawless diamond, had cost more than most people's houses. But that wasn't the part that made his chest feel light as he walked through the marble foyer of the Blackwood estate. It was the plan behind it. He was going to give Victoria the necklace in front of Amara. He was going to say the words he'd been rehearsing in the car. "Mom, I want you and Amara to start fresh. She's my wife. She's not going anywhere. I need the 2 women I love most to find peace." He actually believed, walking up that staircase, that peace was a thing you could hand someone in a box. He heard voices before he reached the bedroom door. His mother's voice, controlled, precise, the tone she used when she wanted something to sound like concern instead of cruelty. "You think because you wear his ring you belong in this family? You are a placeholder, Amara. That's all you've ever been." Ethan stopped walking, he told himself, in the half-second before his hand touched the door, that he'd misheard, that his mother was having one of her moods, the kind Amara always absorbed without complaint, the kind he'd learned to excuse because she raised me alone after Dad died. She's just protective. She doesn't mean it like it sounds. Then he heard his mother's voice drop lower, colder. "He isn't even my real son." The hallway tilted. "I only kept him because his father left everything to him." Ethan's hand hovered an inch from the door. His breath had gone somewhere else, somewhere outside his body. 20 years of memory rearranged itself in that single second. Birthday dinners, hospital visits, the way she used to tuck him in and tell him he was chosen, not accidental, chosen, and none of it would sit still long enough for him to hold on to. And then through the door, so quiet he almost missed it, he heard his wife. "Please," Amara said. "Don't tell him. Not that's not true. Not how dare you. Don't tell him." Ethan stood frozen in the hallway of his own home, holding a diamond meant for a woman who had just called him a placeholder's inheritance, listening to the one person who should have wanted him to know the truth beg for him to be kept in the dark. He did not open the door yet. He needed, for reasons he couldn't have explained even to himself, to understand why, 6 months earlier, Amara Bennett Blackwood had learned the particular geometry of the Blackwood dining room, where to sit so Victoria's gaze wouldn't land on her directly, how to time her comments so they arrived after Victoria had already decided the topic was closed, how to compliment a dish Victoria had criticized without seeming to contradict her. She had not been born knowing these things. She had built them brick by brick over 2 years of marriage, the way you learn to walk quietly through a house with creaking floors. "The seating chart for the gala is wrong," Victoria said that evening, not looking up from her tablet. "Amara, you have us at table 4. Table 4 is where we put vendors." "I can move it," Amara said. "You should have known not to put it there in the first place. I'll fix it tonight." Ethan, cutting into his steak, hadn't looked up either. "Mom, it's a seating chart. Nobody's going to remember where they sat. That's easy for you to say. You didn't spend 30 years building this family's reputation only to have it undone by carelessness." Amara said nothing. She reached for her water glass instead, and if her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it, No one at that table was watching closely enough to notice. No one except perhaps herself. Later that night, alone in the closet she used as a kind of pressure valve, the one room in the mansion with a door that locked and no expectation that she perform composure. Amara sat on the floor between rows of dresses Ethan had bought her and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She did not cry loudly. She had learned not to. Grief that echoed invited questions, and questions from Ethan always seemed to end with him defending someone who wasn't her. She thought about the folder hidden in her closet safe, the one with copies of documents she'd found 8 months ago while helping Ethan's father's estate attorney organize old files, adoption records, a sealed trust, financial records that didn't match the story the Blackwood family told about itself. She thought about the first time she'd tried to tell Ethan something was wrong, not even the full truth, just a fragment, a suggestion that his mother's version of events didn't add up, and the way his face had closed like a door. You don't know her the way I do. She raised me by herself. Whatever you think you found, there's an explanation. There's always an explanation with you people trying to find problems where there aren't any. You people. He hadn't meant it the way it landed. She knew that. He'd been defending his mother on reflex, the way you'd pull your hand back from a stove before your brain caught up to the pain. But the words had lodged in her chest anyway, and she had understood in that moment something important. If she brought him the truth in pieces, he would defend Victoria against each piece individually. He needed to see the whole shape of it at once, undeniable, or he would spend years defending fragments, so she had waited. And in the waiting she had absorbed almost 2 years of small, precise cruelties, because the alternative, telling him too early, watching him choose his mother over her again, felt like a wound she wasn't ready to survive twice. 3 weeks before the night of the necklace, Ethan's brother Trent had come to the house looking grey-faced and unsteady, asking for a private word with Amara before Ethan got home. I moved money, he said, not meeting her eyes. Company money, into an account for, it doesn't matter what it was for. If Ethan finds out before the auditors close the quarter, he'll have me arrested. His own brother. Amara had looked at him for a long moment. She could have let it happen. Some quiet, tired part of her almost wanted to. But she thought about their mother, about Trent's kids, about the version of Ethan who still believed his family was fundamentally decent even when they weren't, and she made a call to a forensic accountant she trusted and quietly helped Trent restructure the numbers before the audit, on the condition that he pay it back within the year and never do it again. He'd thanked her with his eyes on the floor. He never mentioned it again. Neither did she. 2 weeks after that, at a charity dinner, Ethan's sister-in-law Priya had told a small cluster of Victoria's friends that Amara had made a scene at a fitting for the spring gala, storming out when a designer suggested a modest neckline. It wasn't true. Amara had left early because she had a migraine and had told Priya so directly. But the story travelled, gathering detail as it went, until Victoria repeated it back to Amara at dinner as though it were established fact. I heard you humiliated poor Elena at the fitting. That's not what happened. Are you calling Priya a liar? Amara had looked at Priya, who studied her wineglass with sudden fascination, and understood that correcting the record would cost more than it would gain. She let it go. She always let it go. Not because she couldn't fight. She had a spine of quiet steel that no one in that family had bothered to test. But because every fight she picked seemed to cost her standing with Ethan, and every silence she kept seemed, however unfairly, to buy her peace. The dinner that broke something in her happened on a Tuesday. Victoria had spent 20 minutes describing, in front of 3 of Ethan's business associates, how Amara had grown up without the kind of exposure our family is used to. How charming it was that she'd adapted so well, how she hoped Amara would eventually grow into the role. Every sentence wore a smile, every sentence left a mark. Amara smiled through all of it. She always smiled through it. It was, she'd realized long ago, the only form of dignity available to her in that dining room, refusing to let Victoria see the wound land. Afterward, in the car, Ethan had reached over and taken her hand, and for 1 second she thought he might finally say something. Instead, he said, "You seemed tense tonight. Is everything okay? I need things to be smooth with my mother. If you really loved me, you'd stop making her feel like she has to choose between us." Amara looked out the window so he wouldn't see her face change. "I'm not making her choose anything, Ethan. I'm just saying, pick your battles. She's not going to be around forever. I don't want to spend the time she has left refereeing." There it was again, the reflex, the stove-hot instinct to protect his mother even when nothing had been said against her, even when Amara had done nothing but sit and absorb an hour of quiet condescension with a smile on her face. She could have screamed at him. Some version of her in some other life might have. Instead, she said very calmly, "Okay, Ethan," and watched the city lights slide past the window, and understood with total clarity that calm was the only weapon she had left that he couldn't argue with. He never learned that her stillness in that car was the loudest thing she'd ever said to him. Present. The hallway. Ethan stood outside the bedroom door with the necklace in his pocket, replaying 6 months of small refusals to see what was in front of him. The seating chart, the fitting, the car. If you really loved me. He had said that to a woman who had spent 2 years being quietly dismantled by his family and had never once asked him to choose between them. She had simply asked him to believe her, and he hadn't. Inside the room, his mother's voice again, sharper now, sensing something in Amara's silence that displeased her. You've known for months and said nothing. Smart girl, at least you understand your place. I understand more than you think, Amara said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised him. But I didn't keep it quiet for you, Victoria. I kept it quiet for him. How touching. You should be terrified of what happens the day I stop. A pause. The first genuine silence Ethan had ever heard his mother produce. He pushed the door open. Both women turned. Victoria's face performed its transformation in under a second, from cold satisfaction to soft, startled concern, the practiced pivot of a woman who had spent a lifetime rearranging her expression to fit whoever walked into the room. Amara's face did not perform anything. She simply looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear of being caught, but exhaustion, and beneath the exhaustion a terrible kind of relief, as if a wall she'd been holding up with both hands had finally been allowed to fall. Ethan, Victoria said, already reaching for him. Sweetheart, this isn't what it... Am I your son? The question came out flat, not loud. He didn't recognize his own voice. Victoria's mouth opened, closed. For the first time in 35 years, Ethan Blackwood watched his mother search for words and find none. He looked at Amara instead, standing very still by the window, the woman he had told 3 weeks ago in a moving car that loving him meant staying silent. How long, he asked her. Have you known? Amara's chin lifted, just slightly. Whatever she said next, he understood, was going to cost her something to say. And whatever she said next, he was terrified he had spent 2 years teaching her not to trust him enough to hear it. She opened her mouth to answer. Behind him, Victoria finally found her voice. Soft, wounded, achingly familiar. Ethan, honey, let me explain. Whatever she told you, there's context. There's always context. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood didn't turn toward the sound of his mother's voice. He kept his eyes on his wife. The truth that destroyed his world. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. Victoria stood by the window with her hand pressed to her collarbone, the picture of a wounded matriarch waiting for her son's eyes to find her the way they always had. They didn't. Ethan was still looking at Amara, and Amara was still deciding in real time whether 2 years of restraint had earned her the right to finally speak. Everyone downstairs, Ethan said. Now. It wasn't a request. Victoria opened her mouth to object, and something in his face stopped her. She left the room first, chin high, composure rebuilt in the 6 seconds it took to cross the threshold. Amara followed a moment later, close enough to Ethan that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and he caught, just barely, the scent of her perfume, the one he'd bought her their first Christmas together, the one she still wore even after everything, and something in his chest cracked further. They sat in the study. Victoria in the wingback chair she'd claimed as hers since before Ethan could remember. Amara on the edge of the leather sofa, spine straight, hands folded in her lap in the posture of someone bracing for impact. Ethan didn't sit at all. Start with the adoption, he said. Is it true? It wasn't a question by the time it left his mouth. Victoria understood that. Ethan, is it true? His mother's eyes glistened, right on schedule. Amara watched it happen and felt something cold settle in her stomach, because she had seen this exact performance before, in smaller rooms over smaller stakes, and she knew precisely how effective it was. Your father and I couldn't have children, Victoria said, voice trembling beautifully. We tried for 6 years. When the adoption agency called about you, it felt like a miracle. I have loved you since the day they put you in my arms, Ethan. Every single day. That's not what I asked. A beat. Yes, you were adopted. I don't know why that matters so much right now, 35 years later, with your marriage falling apart in front of you. It matters, Ethan said, because I just heard you tell my wife that you only kept me because my father left me everything. So either you loved me since the day they put me in your arms, or you kept me for money. Pick one, Mom. You don't get both. Victoria's tears, for the first time in Ethan's memory, did not immediately produce the effect she was accustomed to. You're twisting my words. I was angry. People say cruel things when they're angry, and Amara has been provoking me for months. I haven't said a word, Amara said quietly. It was the first thing she'd spoken since entering the room. Everyone turned to look at her. I want that on the record. I have not said one word tonight. Everything you heard, Ethan, was your mother talking. Victoria's composure flickered. Not much, but enough. She hadn't accounted for Amara choosing silence as her weapon in this room the way she had chosen it in every room before it. Ethan turned to his wife. His voice, when he spoke to her, was different. Not gentler, exactly, but rawer. "How long have you known?" Amara held his gaze. This was the moment she'd rehearsed and dreaded in equal measure for 8 months, and now that it had arrived, the rehearsed words dissolved and what came out was simpler and more honest than anything she'd planned. 8 months. Ethan flinched like she'd struck him. 8 months. You've known for 8 months that I was adopted, that my whole life was. He stopped, pressed his palm flat against his forehead. And you said nothing. You let me sit at that table defending her, calling her a saint, and you just let me, yes. Why? The word came out cracked, not angry so much as bewildered, a man trying to locate solid ground in a room that kept tilting. "Because I tried to tell you," Amara said. "Not this, I didn't have all of this 8 months ago. Just pieces. But I tried, Ethan. Do you remember the night I said something didn't add up about the trust documents I found while helping the estate attorney? Do you remember what you said to me?" Ethan's jaw worked. He remembered. He didn't answer. "You said I didn't know your mother the way you did. You said there was always an explanation. You told me I was one of those people looking for problems that weren't there." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it got quieter, which made it land harder. "I gave you a fragment of the truth, Ethan, and you didn't investigate it. You defended her against it. So I made a decision. I decided that if I ever told you the rest, it needed to be the whole shape of it at once, undeniable, because I already knew what would happen if I handed it to you piece by piece." "What?" "You'd look at me," she said, "and believe her." The room went silent enough that Ethan could hear the study clock on the mantel, a sound he'd never once noticed in 35 years of walking past it. "That's not fair," he said finally, weakly, because it was the only thing he had. "I know it's not fair," Amara said. "None of it was fair, not to you and not to me. I spent 8 months carrying something that could have blown up your entire understanding of your own life, and I chose to carry it alone instead of putting it on you. Because every single time I tried to hand you even a piece of hard truth about this family, you made me pay for it. You didn't mean to. I don't think you even noticed you were doing it. But I noticed, Ethan. I noticed every time." Victoria, sensing the ground shifting away from her, tried once more. "Ethan, sweetheart, this is exactly what I mean. She's turning this into some kind of conspiracy against her, when all I ever wanted—" "Stop." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You don't get to talk right now." For the second time that night, his mother went quiet. He sat down across from Amara, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment he simply looked at his hands, as if they might contain an answer neither woman in the room could give him. "Tell me everything," he said. "Not fragments, everything you found. I need to hear all of it, from the beginning, and I need you to know that I am going to believe you this time. I need you to trust that, even though I know I haven't earned it yet." Amara studied his face for a long moment, searching for the flicker of defensiveness she'd learned to expect. She didn't find it. What she found instead frightened her more, in a way, a man genuinely, completely unmoored, asking her to hand him a map back to solid ground. 8 months ago," she began, "your father's estate attorney asked me to help sort through some old filing boxes from before the company went digital. Insurance records, old contracts, nothing anyone thought was sensitive. I found a sealed folder that wasn't supposed to be in that box. Adoption paperwork. Yours. Finalized the year you turned 1, processed through a private agency in Ohio, not the hospital you were born in." "Ohio," Ethan repeated. His father had always told the story of driving him home from the hospital 3 miles from this house. "There was also a trust document," Amara continued, "older than the adoption paperwork, naming a set of biological parents I'd never heard mentioned in this family. Ever, not once, in 2 years of dinners and holidays and stories about your childhood. The trust was substantial, Ethan, and it named you as sole beneficiary contingent on adoption completion within a specific window." Victoria's hands, folded in her lap, had gone white-knuckled. "I did some digging," Amara said, quietly. "I didn't want to blow up your life over a filing cabinet mistake. So I hired someone independent, someone with no connection to this family, to verify what I'd found before I brought it anywhere near you. That's when I found the second thing." "What second thing?" Amara glanced, just once, at Victoria. Then back to Ethan. "Your biological parents didn't die of natural causes the way everyone in this family always implied when the subject came up. There was a financial dispute, something connected to a business your biological father was involved in, something your mother." She nodded at Victoria without looking at her again. "Had information about, information that might have helped them. She didn't come forward with it. 2 months later, they were dead, and you were placed for adoption, and the trust transferred." The clock on the mantel ticked through 4 full seconds of silence. That's not proof of anything, Victoria said, too fast, too sharp. You're implying something monstrous based on documents you don't understand, cobbled together by some private investigator with an agenda. I'm not implying you did anything to them, Amara said evenly. I never said that, and I want to be very clear that I'm not saying it now. What I'm saying is that you had information and you chose silence, and that silence benefited you directly. That's not a conspiracy theory. Victoria, that's a paper trail. Ethan looked at his mother, really looked at her the way he hadn't allowed himself to in 35 years, and saw for the first time not the woman who'd raised him, but a stranger wearing her face. Is any of it untrue? He asked her, not loud, almost gentle, in a terrible way, any single part. Victoria's mouth opened, nothing came out, her eyes, still glistening, no longer commanded the room the way they always had. Something had broken between mother and son that no amount of tears would repair tonight, and some small, honest part of her seemed to understand that even as she reached for the performance one more time. I did what I had to do to protect this family, she said finally. Everything I did so you would have a life, a real life, money, security, a name that meant something. You did it, Ethan said quietly. So you would have that, not me. You just needed me alive and adopted to get it. He stood up. He didn't look at his mother again. He looked at Amara instead, and something in his expression, grief and shame, and something rawer that hadn't fully formed a name yet, made her chest ache in a way 2 years of small cruelties never had. You tried to tell me, he said, 8 months ago, and probably before that too, in ways I didn't even notice, and I punished you for it every time. I need you to know that I understand that now. I don't expect you to just. He stopped, jaw tight. I don't expect anything from you right now. I just needed you to hear me say I understand it. Amara's eyes were wet for the first time all night, though she didn't let the tears fall. I know you're only understanding it because you have no choice left, she said. I need you to understand it even when it's inconvenient. That's the part that was always missing, Ethan. Not tonight, every night before this one. He didn't have an answer for that. He knew, standing in his father's study with his mother's silence, confirming everything Amara had carried alone for 8 months, that an answer wasn't something he could produce with words tonight. It was going to have to be produced with time, and he didn't yet know if Amara had any left to give him. Later, long after Victoria had been asked to leave and the house had gone dark and quiet, Ethan sat alone in the study with a single folder open in front of him, the one Amara had finally handed over, the physical proof of everything she'd spent 8 months protecting him from and protecting him with, both at once. Near the bottom of the folder was a letter, not from Victoria, from his adoptive father, dated 4 years before his death, sealed and never delivered, addressed simply, "For Ethan when he's ready." Ethan's hands weren't quite steady as he opened it. For 35 years, Ethan Blackwood had built his entire understanding of family around the woman down the hall. Loyalty, protection, never abandoning the people who raised you, no matter what. For the first time in 35 years, sitting alone with his father's unopened handwriting in front of him, Ethan realized he had spent his whole life asking the wrong person what family meant. The woman he finally lost, Amara, left on a Thursday morning, while Ethan was in an emergency board call he couldn't reschedule. She didn't announce it dramatically. She packed 2 suitcases, left her wedding ring on the dresser next to a short note, and was gone before he came upstairs to look for her. "I'm not leaving because of what your mother did. I'm leaving because I need to know who you are when there's no fire left to put out. I love you. That was never the problem." Ethan read it 4 times standing in the doorway of their bedroom, and then he sat down on the edge of the bed she'd made before she left. She'd made the bed even then, even leaving him, and for a long time he didn't do anything at all. The house learned her absence in small increments over the following weeks, the way a body learns the absence of a limb. Her chair at the breakfast table stayed empty. The staff, out of some unspoken instinct, stopped setting a place there after the 2nd week, and the first morning Ethan came down to find only 1 plate set. Something in him nearly buckled. Her coffee. She drank a specific brand, ordered from a small roastery in the city, always the same order, always in the same blue mug she'd brought from her old apartment and refused to replace with anything from the mansion's expensive kitchenware. Disappeared from the pantry. Ethan found the empty space where the bag used to sit and stood in front of it for almost a minute before he understood why it bothered him so much. Small things. A hairpin on the bathroom counter, gone. The particular quiet of her reading in the corner chair in the evenings, gone. The way she used to hum, almost inaudibly, when she thought no one could hear her, while she watered the small herb garden she'd insisted on keeping on the terrace despite Victoria's repeated suggestion that it looked unrefined. The herbs went untended, and within 2 weeks they had started to wilt, and Ethan found himself standing over them one evening with a watering can in his hand, unsure whether he was trying to save the plants or something less tangible. He didn't call her. She had asked, in the note, for space to see who he was without a crisis in front of him, and he understood with a clarity that surprised him that calling her now, begging, apologizing, performing urgency, would only prove he still didn't understand the lesson. So instead he did something he had never once done in 35 years. He investigated his own family. He started with Trent. His brother came to the office looking braced for the worst, the way he always did when Ethan asked to see him without explanation. Ethan had spent a week going through the financial records Amara's folder had pointed him toward, and what he found matched a name he hadn't expected. An account restructured 8 months ago, quietly, cleanly, no trace of it in the official audit that quarter. "You misused company funds," Ethan said without preamble, 8 months ago, and it got fixed before it could destroy you. Trent's face went the color of paper. "Ethan, I can explain. I'm not asking for an explanation of the misuse. I already understand that part. I want to know who fixed it." His brother's eyes dropped to the floor, and in the silence Ethan understood before Trent said a word. "Amara," Trent said quietly. "She found out before it went to audit. She got a forensic accountant to help me restructure it. She never told you. She never told anyone. She just fixed it and made me promise to pay it back and never brought it up again." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. He thought about every family dinner in the past 8 months, where Trent had sat across the table making small jokes at Amara's expense, deflecting Victoria's criticisms of her onto easier targets, never once defending her, never once mentioning that she had quietly saved him from prison. "She protected you," Ethan said, "and you let my mother humiliate her at the dinner table without saying a word." Trent had no answer. There wasn't one that would have mattered. He found Priya next. At a lunch he requested under the pretense of discussing a charity board seat. He didn't need the pretense in the end. She gave herself away within 10 minutes, nervous under the direct weight of his attention in a way she'd never had to be before. "The story about the fitting," Ethan said, "Amara storming out, humiliating the designer. Where did that come from?" Priya's composure cracked faster than Trent's had. "It got exaggerated. I might have said something offhand, and it just took on a life of its own. She had a migraine. She told you directly. And you let a room full of my mother's friends believe she'd thrown a tantrum. Your mother was asking about her," Priya said. "Defensive now, the way cornered people get defensive. I didn't know what else to say. Victoria has a way of making you feel like you have to give her something." That at least Ethan understood better than he wanted to. He recognized the particular gravity his mother exerted on people around her, the way she made silence feel like betrayal and honesty feel like danger. He'd spent 35 years orbiting that same gravity himself. It didn't excuse what Priya had done, but it clarified with uncomfortable precision exactly how his mother operated and how many people in his life had been quietly recruited into her version of events without ever quite agreeing to it. "You'll correct it," he said, "publicly at the next event where it matters, not because I'm asking as a favor, because it's true and it was never fair to her." Priya didn't argue. The letter from his father took longer to fully absorb than either conversation. He read it a dozen times over those weeks, in different rooms of a house that felt too large and too quiet. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you myself, which tells you something about the kind of coward grief makes of even good men. You were adopted. I loved you the moment I held you, and I have never once, not for a single day, thought of you as anything other than my son in every way that matters. Your mother's reasons for wanting the adoption were more complicated than mine. I loved her too much for too long to look closely at that. I regret it. If you're reading this now, look closely at what I couldn't. Whatever you find, know that loving you was never the complicated part. That part was always simple." Ethan sat with that letter until the light in the study changed from afternoon to evening, and thought about a version of his father he'd never been permitted to know. A man who had seen something in his wife and chosen, out of love or cowardice or both, to look away from it, the same way Ethan had spent 2 years looking away from what his mother did to Amara. I inherited more than his company, Ethan thought. I inherited his blindness too. He understood, sitting there, that he had built his entire adult identity on being nothing like the people who'd hurt him, and had somehow become, in the most important way, exactly like the one person he thought he was protecting. The confrontation with Victoria happened 2 weeks later, in the same study, under the same lamp. She had called it, expecting. He could see it in the careful way she'd dressed, the rehearsed softness in her posture, an opportunity to repair things the way she always had. Tears, a story about sacrifice, an appeal to the 20 years of birthdays and bedtime stories that had always before now worked. Ethan sat across from her and said nothing for a long moment, and something about his stillness unsettled her more than any accusation could have. "I've spoken to Trent," he said finally. "And Priya. I've read Dad's letter. I've been through every document in the folder Amara built. Twice. Ethan, I know I made mistakes, but everything I did." "You didn't make mistakes," he said quietly enough that she had to lean forward to hear it. "Mistakes are accidents. What you did was a series of choices, made consistently, over 35 years, to protect your position at the cost of everyone around you. My biological parents, my father who spent the rest of his life afraid to tell me the truth because he loved you too much to see clearly, my wife, who you spent 2 years dismantling because she was the first person who made me capable of thinking without your permission." Victoria's eyes filled. It had worked every time before. "I raised you. I gave up everything. You gave up nothing," Ethan said. "You gained everything. A son, a fortune, a family that gave you standing you'd never have had otherwise. I'm not saying you never loved me. I think, in whatever way you're capable of it, you did. But you loved me the way you love things you own, not the way you love things you'd protect at cost to yourself. There's a difference. Amara taught me the difference, because she lived it in front of me for 2 years while I was too blind to see it." Victoria tried tears again, more openly this time. Ethan watched them fall and felt, for the first time in his life, nothing move in his chest in response. She tried motherhood next. The old stories, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights she claimed to remember from his infancy, despite never having carried him. Ethan let her finish. "You spent my entire life teaching me that family means never abandoning the people who hurt you," he said finally. "Amara taught me something different. She taught me that love without truth is just control wearing a softer name." The study was silent except for the mantel clock. "What happens now?" Victoria asked. And for the first time that evening, her voice held something that sounded almost like real fear rather than performed fragility. "You're removed from every board position connected to the company," Ethan said. "Effective this week. Your access to family accounts beyond your personal allowance ends today, and you will not contact Amara ever again in any form, for any reason. You're punishing me for loving you the only way I knew how. I'm holding you accountable," Ethan said, standing. "For 35 years of choosing yourself and calling it love. Those aren't the same thing, Mum. I only just learned the difference. I'm not going to unlearn it because you're crying." He made the correction public 2 days later, a brief, carefully worded statement at a company event, acknowledging that false stories about his wife had circulated within his own family and that he took full responsibility for having believed them longer than he should have. He didn't name every detail. He didn't need to. It was enough, in that room full of people who'd watched Victoria diminish Amara at a dozen dinners and galas over 2 years, to see Ethan Blackwood stand up and say, plainly, that his wife had been wronged and that the wrong had come from people he trusted more than he should have. It made the business pages. It made his mother's social circle go quiet in a way money couldn't fix. It did not bring Amara home. He drove past the small apartment building where he knew, through channels he was careful not to overuse, that she'd been staying. He didn't go up. He sat in the car for 11 minutes, watching a light in a third-floor window, and then he drove away, because showing up uninvited after everything would have proven exactly the thing she'd left to find out. Whether he could learn restraint, or whether every lesson would collapse the moment he wanted something suddenly enough, he had changed. He believed that, and he thought, watching that window recede in his mirror, that the belief might not be enough. The question that had opened this entire story sat in his chest now, reversed and heavier. Not why had she protected him, but whether 2 years of silence, however loving its intention, could survive being answered by 2 months of a man finally trying to become someone worth that silence. He didn't know. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Blackwood didn't know if he'd get the thing he wanted, no matter how much he was willing to pay for it. The second chance, Amara came back to the estate exactly once during those 2 months, on a Saturday afternoon, to collect the rest of her books. She'd texted ahead so there'd be no surprise, no ambush of emotion neither of them was ready for. Ethan made sure he wasn't home when she arrived. It was, he'd decided, the only gift he had left to give her that cost him something real, the willingness to not be there, to let her move through what had been her house without his presence pressing on the air. He came home that evening to find the bookshelves in the study half empty, and stood in front of the gaps for a long time before he made himself stop looking. The invitation to the Whitmore Foundation Gala arrived, as it did every year, 3 weeks later. Ethan almost declined. Then he thought about what declining would mean, 1 more year of managing his image instead of confronting it, and he understood that this, of all places, was where the correction needed to happen in full view of the exact people who had watched it go wrong. He didn't know Amara would be there until he saw her across the ballroom in a dress the color of the sky just before a storm breaks, and something in his chest did the thing it always did when he saw her, except now it was tangled with 2 months of fear that he might have run out of time to do anything about it. She saw him. She didn't look away, and she didn't come closer either. She simply held his gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then turned back to the conversation she'd been having with someone from the Foundation's board. Ethan understood the message. I'm not hiding from you. I'm also not running to you. It was, in its way, more hopeful than he'd expected, and more frightening. He didn't approach her that night. Instead, he did something he'd been planning for a week. He took the small stage set up for the evening's remarks, a slot originally reserved for a brief thank you to donors, and instead of the speech his assistant had prepared, he set the notecards down and spoke without them. Most of you know my family, he said. Some of you have sat at our table. Over the past 2 years, a woman who became part of this family through marriage was treated, in this circle and in my own home, in ways that were unfair, untrue, and beneath every one of us who allowed it to happen, myself most of all. I want to say clearly in this room that the stories some of you heard about my wife, about a scene at a fitting, about disrespect toward my mother, about a woman who didn't belong in this family were false. I believed versions of those stories longer than I should have, because believing them was easier than confronting what was actually happening in my own house. That was my failure, not hers. She spent 2 years absorbing cruelty with more grace than I deserved from her, and I intend to spend considerably longer than 2 years making that right. The room had gone very quiet. Across the space, Anne stood perfectly still, her wine glass forgotten in her hand. I'm not asking anyone here to forgive me, Ethan continued. I'm asking you to correct the record when you hear the old version of this story repeated, because my wife deserves to walk into a room like this one without carrying 2 years of lies that were never hers to carry. He stepped down without waiting for applause. There was some, anyway, uncertain and scattered, but he barely registered it. He was watching Amara, who hadn't moved, whose expression he couldn't read from that distance, and who, when he finally crossed the room toward her, didn't step back and didn't step forward either. You didn't have to do that in front of everyone, she said quietly when he reached her. Yes, I did, Ethan said. You were humiliated in front of these people for 2 years. It wasn't going to be fixed in private. She studied him for a long moment. That's the first time, she said slowly, you've ever chosen the harder version of doing right by me over the easier one. I know, he said. I'm sorry it took this long to learn how. They didn't reconcile that night. He didn't ask her to, and she didn't offer. She thanked him with a strange formal gentleness that hurt more than anger would have, and excused herself to speak with someone else, and Ethan let her go, because pushing for more in that moment would have meant he'd learned nothing at all. But she called him 3 days later, not to reconcile. She was careful in the first sentence to say so directly, but to ask if he'd meet her somewhere neutral, to talk without an audience and without the pressure of a crisis forcing either of their hands. They met at a small cafe neither of them had ever been to together, a place with no history attached to it, no memory either of them would have to navigate around. She ordered her coffee, the specific roastery blend, in a paper cup instead of the blue mug he still hadn't been able to throw away, and sat across from him with her hands wrapped around it like she needed something to hold on to. I've had 2 months to think about what I want to say to you, she said. I'm not going to pretend I have it all figured out, but I know a few things clearly now, and I want to say them before I lose the nerve. Ethan waited. He'd promised himself, walking in, that he would let her finish everything before he said a word. I loved you the entire time I was protecting your family's secrets, Amara said. That was never in question for me. Even when I was exhausted, even when I was furious, even the night I packed those suitcases, I loved you. That's not the thing that broke. What broke was my belief that you'd choose truth over comfort when it mattered. And I need you to understand that fixing that isn't something one speech at a gala can do, however much it meant to me that you gave it. I know, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to keep proving yourself with grand gestures, she continued. I don't want speeches. I want the boring, unglamorous version, the version where you believe me the first time, in private, with no audience and nothing at stake for your image. That's the version that actually matters, and it's the version I haven't seen yet, because we haven't had the chance to test it without a crisis attached. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. He'd debated, for days, whether to bring what he'd brought. He set the small velvet box on the table between them. The one from the night this had all started, the necklace still inside it, untouched since that night. Amara looked at it for a long moment, then back up at him, and something in her expression went very still. I'm not giving you this to buy anything, Ethan said quietly. I want to be clear about that before you say anything. I brought it because I needed you to see me put it down. It was supposed to be for my mother that night. It represented everything I thought loyalty meant. Blood, obligation, never questioning the people who raised you, no matter what it cost, the people who actually loved me honestly. I don't want it to represent that anymore. I don't know if it can. So I'm not asking you to wear it. I just needed to stop carrying it as if it still meant what I thought it meant that night. Amara didn't reach for the box. I don't want it, she said gently but without hesitation. Good, Ethan said, and something in his face, for the first time that whole conversation, looked almost like relief. It was never meant to buy your forgiveness. I'd rather you never touch it than have you think that's what I was offering. He put the box away. Then, from his other pocket, he took out something smaller, her wedding ring, the one she'd left on the dresser the morning she'd gone. He didn't slide it across the table toward her. He simply set it down, closer to himself than to her, and let it sit there between them without pressure. I'm not asking you to forget what I did, he said. I don't think you should. I don't think I should either. I think forgetting it is exactly how I'd end up doing it again in some smaller way. 5 years from now, the first time it's inconvenient to believe you over someone else. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had lost the careful composure he'd been holding on to all evening. I'm asking you to give me the chance to become the husband I should have been before I almost lost you. Not tonight. Not because of one speech or one gesture. Over time. However long it takes for you to trust that the version of me you saw at that gala isn't a performance I can only manage once. The cafe noise continued around them. Cups, conversation, a door chime somewhere near the entrance, and Amara sat with her hands around her coffee, looking at the ring on the table for long enough that Ethan made himself stay quiet and let the silence be hers to fill. I'm not going to answer that tonight, she said finally. I know, Ethan said. I wasn't expecting you to, but I'll tell you this much. She looked up at him, and for the first time in the whole conversation, something in her expression softened without losing its edge. I still love you. I never stopped. Not even the morning I left. That was never the part in question. The part in question is whether you can be trusted with that love without me having to protect you from your own family's version of the truth. I think you might starting to prove that you can. I'm not sure yet. But I'm willing to find out slowly, without pretending the last 2 years didn't happen. She reached out finally and picked up the ring, not to put it on, not yet, but to hold it, turning it once between her fingers before closing her hand around it. That's not a yes, she said. I know, Ethan said again. And for the first time in months, something in his chest that had been clenched since the night he'd stood outside their bedroom door with a necklace for the wrong woman finally, slightly began to loosen. It's not a no either. No, Amara agreed. It's not. They didn't leave the cafe together that night, holding hands, healed in the way a story might have promised at its beginning. She kept the ring, she didn't put it on. She told him she'd call him and she meant it, and he let her walk out first because that, too, was part of learning to give her the things he'd never given her before. Time and the absence of pressure and the simple respect of letting her decide instead of deciding for her. It took another 6 weeks. 6 weeks of small, unglamorous proof, of Ethan believing her the first time about a dozen minor things that would once have gone to his mother's version instead, of quiet dinners with no audience and nothing at stake for his image, before Amara moved back into the house that had once felt, to her, like a place she had to survive rather than live in. She didn't come back because he was a billionaire. She came back because for 6 weeks running, in rooms with no one watching, he had chosen truth over comfort, over and over, in ways too small for anyone but her to notice. On the evening she finally slid the ring back onto her finger, quietly at their kitchen table, no gala, no speech, no audience at all. Ethan didn't reach for the velvet box that still sat untouched in a drawer of his desk. He understood, finally, what it had taken him 35 years and the near total loss of the only person who'd ever loved him honestly to learn. Family was never the people you couldn't leave. It was the people who told you the truth, even when it cost them everything to do it, and stayed anyway, not out of obligation, but because love, when it was real, had never once required you to choose it blindly.